Sholem Aleichem. So good to be here. I'm all dressed up, as you can see, for the occasion. And the occasion is to honor one of the greatest comic writers of all time. As it happens, he loved to dress up too, not only when he posed for the camera, but also at home. His youngest daughter, Marie, remembered that her father would sometimes change his vest several times a day. Dressing up is also important because, like my mother, Masha Roskies, Sholem Aleichem believed that Yiddish muss gehen schön angetan. When you represent Yiddish, which can also mean when you present yourself as a Jew, you've got to wear your Sunday best. Raising the cultural status of Yiddish mattered greatly to Sholem Aleichem. The proper spelling of Yiddish mattered to Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem took Yiddish humor very seriously, and so do I. Why do great comic masters appear when they do? Cervantes in Spain, Shakespeare in England, Molière in France, Gogol in Russia, Mark Twain in America. So let me answer with the 3 L's: language, literary home, and life. It happens, first of all, when their spoken language, Spanish, Queen's English, French, Russian, American, is bursting with untapped potential. When our story begins at the turn of the 20th century, this was certainly true for Yiddish, the spoken vernacular of most of world Jewry. Sholem Aleichem was the first writer to fully exploit the orality of Yiddish, its wealth of proverbial expressions, its curses, its blessings, its omens, its incantations, its nonsense rhymes, its scriptural parodies, its repertoire of joke situations, its 3 distinct dialects, Lithuanian, Polish, Ukrainian, its high and low linguistic registers, its artful way of turning foreign languages into High Goyish and Low Goyish. High Goyish is Russian or German. Those were the imperial languages, the languages of officialdom, of the powers that be. Low Goyish, that is from a Yiddish perspective, were Polish and Ukrainian, the peasant vernaculars, languages of the marketplace, the languages of daily interaction. All this and much more allowed Sholem Aleichem to unlock the comic potential of the Yiddish language in its manifold settings: urban and rural, marketplace and workplace, cheder and house of study, at home and on the road, north and south, old country and new. Secondly, a great comic master appears when there's a stable literary home for comedy, when there's a Globe Theatre, when there's a Comédie Française, and when there's a flourishing press. Sholem Aleichem belonged to the first generation of Jewish writers to launch his career in the Yiddish press. His favorite genre was the feuilleton, a genre that was born out of newspapers, a breezy, chatty, and wickedly satiric personal essay, which Sholem Aleichem made into topical sketches of contemporary Jewish life. These, Solomon Rabinovitch, his real name, published under various comical pen names, until he hit on Sholem Aleichem. How do you do? Always on the road, always on the lookout for a good story. The medium was the message, all the news that could be retold in a comic vein. Our story begins in 1899, when the Zionist Executive Council in Krakow comes up with a brilliant plan to circumvent the ban on Yiddish newspapers in Tsarist Russia. by publishing the paper in Krakow, just across the border in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by setting up the editorial offices in Warsaw, in the epicenter of Russian-Polish Jewry, and by inviting the best Jewish writers, young and old, to publish in its pages. Thus was born Der Yid, the first modern Yiddish newspaper in Eastern Europe. Our story begins when the 40-year-old Solomon Rabinovitch, formerly a big shot on the Kiev Stock Exchange, gets a new lease on life. With the appearance of Der Yid, Jewish writers now have a stable and viable Yiddish home. This inspires Rabinovitch to make the move he's been wanting to make but couldn't, to throw himself, body and soul, into the Yiddish literary scene, to write stories that not only reflect the life of the people, but will also give shape and meaning to that life. Which brings us to the third reason. A great comic writer appears when life is changing so fast that only a chosen few can keep pace with these changes and cut them down to comic size. Jewish life was in crisis, economic, political, social, religious. Jews were abandoning the shtetl for the big city, leaving the old country for the new, exchanging the faith that had sustained them for millennia with new ideas of political, economic, and individual freedom, and choosing to raise their children in foreign tongues. Solomon Rabinovitch knew all this firsthand. He had suffered a devastating economic blow in 1890 when he lost his late father-in-law's fortune in the Kiev Stock Exchange crash and was forced to give up on all his ambitious literary projects. In 1894, Rabinovitch wrote to the editor of Die Toib, a Yiddish newspaper in Pittsburgh. He said, "Von Sholem Aleichem is geworden Olav HaSholem. Mr. How do you do has become Mr. Has-been." Meanwhile, in the Rabinovitch household, relocated from Kiev to Odessa and then back to Kiev, the spoken language was Russian, not Yiddish. Everything was being upended. There wasn't a moment to lose. And at that very moment, Sholem Aleichem set out to write La Comédie Juive, the great Jewish comedy. Starting at the turn of the century, and in the pages of Der Yid, Sholem Aleichem experiences an unprecedented burst of creativity. He brings back two of his most memorable characters, Tevye the dairyman and Menachem Mendel the Luftmensch. He starts writing stories for children, mostly set around the celebration of the Jewish holidays. And that will be the subject of my next lecture. And he invents Kasrilevke, the town of the little people, our subject for today. How does a writer invent a town? Well, Gogol, we know, invented a Ukrainian village called Dikanka. Mark Twain invented St. Petersburg, a close cousin of Hannibal, Missouri, his hometown. And Sholem Aleichem is most famous for the shtetl of Kasrilevke. Please note the correct pronunciation, Kasrilevke. Okay, so Obviously, he wasn't starting from scratch. Sholem Aleichem was mining a rich field. For starters, the shtetl, the Jewish market town, was a favorite subject of Yiddish folklore. Kasrilevke reminds us of Sholem, the legendary town of fools. Sholem and Kasrilevke are twin cities. Like the Chelemites, the people of Kasrilevke, to a man and woman, act and react as one. They always behave as a collective. They embody the shtetl mentality. When faced with a problem, they will inevitably come up with the most impractical solution. They too react in a way that seems implausible to us and makes us laugh. Secondly, Sholem Aleichem started his career as a maskil, modernizer, social reformer. I mean, look at the way he dressed. For the maskilim, the shtetl represented the heart of darkness. Small-town Jewish life seemed hopelessly corrupt and backward. The shtetl became the favorite butt of 19th century Jewish satire. And Sholem Aleichem was no exception. Writing in Hebrew for a maskilic newspaper called Hamelitz, about a decade before our story begins, Sholem Aleichem publishes a whole series of shtetl vignettes called Tmunot Utzlalim Michayei HaYudim B'Mazepevka, scenes and shadows from the life of the Jews in Mazepevka. For every scene, there are many shadows. Mazepevka, by the way, is based not on the shtetl of Voronka, where he spent his childhood, but on the mid-sized town of Pereyaslev, where he was born and spent his adolescence. So long as Sholem Aleichem remained wedded to the ideology of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, he saw the shtetl as standing in the way of progress. If only they could clean up their act. If only they could stop being so foolish. If only they could stop overreacting to every bit of news that penetrated from the outside world. Still, thanks to these early satires, Sholem Aleichem came armed with a few ready-made plots. So, Kasrilevke will be the twin city of Sholem, but will also borrow from the scenes and shadows of Mazepevka. Here, to convince us that Kasrilevke is real as only great works of fiction can make things real, is Sholem Aleichem, both native, son, and world traveler. A benign presence with a slightly mocking demeanor. Let's imagine him looking something like this. I now invite you to open the pages of Der Yid in 1901 as Sholem Aleichem introduces us to the town of the little people, as I try to impersonate his voice in both English and Yiddish. Von wann nimmt sich der Nomen Kasrilevke? How did the name Kasrilevke originate? I'll tell you. So, how is he going to make Kasrilevke a real place, even though it isn't? The evke, Kasrilevke, this evke suffix, firmly situates the town somewhere in the Slavic outback, probably, as we will soon hear, in the depths of Ukraine. Then he gives the town a fake etymology. Sholem Aleichem begins by listing 11 Yiddish synonyms for a pauper. No language, presumably, has a richer lexicon of such names than Yiddish, leading up to the 12th and last, a Kasril or Kasrilik. Kasril or Kasrilik, that name is spoken with another melody altogether. For instance, Oy, am I ever a Kasrilevke? You bet your life. A Kasrilevke is no ordinary pauper, a good-for-nothing. This is a kind of pauper who doesn't feel degraded by his poverty. God forbid. On the contrary, it's a source of pride. Simply put, it means poor, but also happy. Where did Sholem Aleichem come up with this comic name, Kasrilevke? It certainly has a Jewish ring to it because it contains the Hebrew root keter, crown. Did he find it ready-made in the folklore of his native Ukraine? We may never know. But we already know a great deal about the narrator. We know that not only is he a connoisseur of Jewish life, he's also something of a performer. He's almost a stand-up comedian because he adopts a particular Jewish mode of speaking, a Talmudic sing-song, which in Yiddish sounds like this. A Kasriel oder a Kasrilevke, der Dosiker Nomen wird aroisgerät, schon gar miteinander nigen. Lemoshel, Oi, bin ich ken ein Ora a Kasrilevke. Kasrilevke, das ist schon nicht glatt als euer Kapzen a Schlemazel. Das ist schon, versteht ihr mich. Azam in eurem Mann, was fällt nicht, has für Sholem arop bei sich mit seiner Ormkeit. Adrabe, es ist gar a Gedule. Auf unser Loschen heißt es, an Orems und auf Freilachs. So, both his niggin, his melody, and his diction, his choice of words, his specific vocabulary are recognizably Jewish. His diction is full of formulaic expressions borrowed from the world of Jewish learning, the house of study, the Bes Medrash. It's a Yiddish spoken mostly by men who graduated from Cheder, and it borrows heavily from the Hebrew-Aramaic component of Yiddish, like Kenai Nore, no evil eye, Chas v'sholem, by no means, and Adrabe, on the contrary. This way of speaking inspires confidence. It creates an intimate bond between the speaker and his audience. We trust that what he says is true. And Sholem Aleichem is going to need our trust, because whoever heard of such a place? Whoever heard of a whole town of happy paupers? Where else but in Kasrilevke is there such an integrated society? Because everyone is poverty-stricken to the same degree. What other poverty-stricken shtetl carries its poverty as a badge of pride? Poverty is their yichus. Oy, am I ever a Kasrilevke? You bet your life. The people of Kasrilevke are poor and happy because they have a secret weapon. That weapon is their proverbial speech, their wicked sense of humor, their ingrained optimism. This allows them to laugh off their economic plight. The fame of these little people has spread far and wide thanks to their single most important export, their comic speech and talent for talkback. That's how they all are, these people. They're known everywhere as Groise Balahamtsoes, famously inventive, or, as we say in plain Yiddish, Wertelzogers, jokesters, jesters, for example. The world is a wheel and it keeps turning. The Kasrilevkite repeats this maxim and shows you with his hand how it turns. To him, a maxim, a witty remark, is everything. For an apt remark, he will forsake his mother and father, as the saying goes. The tales you hear about these people sound fabulous, but you may be sure they are all true. Kasrilevke, you see, is not so much a real place as a state of mind. what the French call a mentalité. As such, it is infinitely adaptable to changing circumstances. And these circumstances are drastically changing. The days of capturing the moon in a barrel are long since behind us. Kasrilevke is a child of the new century. It faces radically new problems, serious challenges, not only from within, like endemic poverty, but also from without. Inventing, or perhaps more accurately reinventing Kasrilevke was an act of genius. For Kasrilevke was the living embodiment of Sholem Aleichem's unique blend of comedy and tragedy. These stories are true. They are rooted in the lived experience of the Jewish people, never more dramatic than now. These true life stories are also hilarious because they're about people endowed with a terrific sense of humor, with an amazingly upbeat, optimistic, and irreverent take on life, even though that life is tragic. The people are penniless. There is no solution to their economic plight. So here is the story of Dreyfus in Kasrilevke. First published in Der Yid in February 1902, as narrated by our beloved native son and man about town, Sholem Aleichem. I wonder if the Dreyfus affair made such an impression anywhere in the whole world as it did in Kasrilevke. Paris, they tell me, boiled like water in an overheated kettle. Newspapers wrote, generals shot themselves. Frenchmen ran about the streets like crazy people, throwing their hats in the air. One Frenchman screamed, "Long live Dreyfus!" Another screamed, "Long live Esterhazy!" And as for the Jews, while all this was going on, they were smeared with mud by everyone, exactly as usual. But the agony, the pain and despair that Kasrilevke lived through from all this, that, I tell you, Paris will never match, not until the coming of the Messiah. Sholem Aleichem is a city dweller. He's media savvy. He can even quote the screaming headlines in the French original. He can say, "Vive Dreyfus, vive Esterhazy." But he's also clearly one of us. And as for the Jews, he says, while all this was going on, they were smeared with mud by everyone, exactly as usual. Was the Dreyfus affair exactly as usual? Jews being scapegoated at the slightest provocation? And if so, why was the response of Kasrilevke so extreme? More extreme, supposedly, than that of Jews in the rest of the world. More to the point, if the shtetl was so isolated and remote, how did historical events reach them all together? This is the next question, to which our newspaper correspondent will answer the Jewish way by asking a string of other questions. How in Kasrilevke did they ever find out about Dreyfus in the first place? Don't ask me. How, for instance, did they find out about the war of the English against the Boers? How did they know what's going on in China? What kind of an alliance does Kasrilevke have with China? Are they drawn together because of the great commerce that Kasrilevke carries on with China? No. Tea, Kasrilevke imports, not from China, but from Vysotsky in Moscow. And as for the airy summer stuff that the Chinese call pongee, who in Kasrilevke could ever find enough in his pocket to put silk on his back? Thank God, if in summer they can afford a shirt of cotton. For if not that, they'd have no choice at all. They'd simply have to walk around with nothing on. The shtetl is a small and isolated place that doesn't traffic in the import of fancy goods. It's a traditional society that engages with the world emotively, not economically, not through the laws of supply and demand. Insular though they be, however, they've even heard of the Boer War fought somewhere on the African continent. They know what's going on in the outside world because news of that world reaches them through newspapers. Actually, only one. Bleibt doch als die eigene Kasche. So we come back to the same question. How in Kasrilevke did they find out the whole story about Dreyfus? From Shtetl. Shtetl, Reb Shayas, is the only one in town who subscribes to a newspaper, the Tzvira. And everything that goes on in the great world outside, they discover from him. That is, not from him, but truthfully through him. He reads to them and they translate. He recounts and they interpret the correct meaning. He gives them exactly what's in the newspaper, and they often give his words exactly the opposite meaning, because they understand everything better. Shtetl Reb Shayas ist der einzige in Stadt, was schreibt aus dem Tzvira. Und alle Neuesten, was tun sich ab auf der Welt, wird man geweuert von ihm. Das heißt, nicht von ihm, nur durch ihn. Lehnt sie und sie verteidigen. Erzählt und sie lernen dem Schat. Sagt, was es steht, und sie dringen oft verkehrt. Warum sie verstehen besser. Shtetl Reb Shayas is the sole subscriber to the Hebrew daily Hatzvira, which they fondly call Tzvira for short, that arrives in the mail all the way from Warsaw. Because it is printed in Hebrew, the men in town, all graduates of the Cheder, subject its highfalutin language to textual scrutiny, as they would a sacred source. Lehnt sie und sie verteidigen. Erzählt sie und sie lernen dem Schat. Sagt sie, was es steht, und sie dringen auf verkehrt, warum sie verstehen besser. Sie verteidigen means that they provide a word-for-word translation into Yiddish, the same way that the Bible was taught to them in Cheder. While lernen dem Pshat, to interpret the contextual meaning or to deduce, packs the comic punch. They understood everything better. Better than whom? Better than Shtetl, the local intellectual, the modernizer, the maskil. They consider his reading to be naive because he gives them exactly what's in the paper. He gives them the facts, but they're not interested in the facts. They want to know the meaning of the facts. What about Sholem Aleichem's immediate readers? They need a refresher course if they are to feel the here-ness and now-ness of the Dreyfus affair. They need the people of Kasrilevke to give the news a human face. Kasrilevke does not view the media as a faceless medium. Who personifies the news is their local intellectual, Shtetl Reb Shayas, who will show up in other stories, by the way, the sole subscriber to the Hebrew paper. Shtetl is the comic bridge figure between the believers in progress, enlightenment, and international trade, and the stubborn Jews of Kasrilevke. Shtetl, however, is greatly outnumbered by an extremely talkative and argumentative community of Jews who refuse to accept the latest news at face value. They contest the plain meaning of the facts. Meanwhile, as we were reminded in the opening paragraph, the Dreyfus affair itself was the product of the press. It played out in the pages of French and later the world press. In literary terms, the story thematizes the impact of the press on Jewish life. Okay, So what do the people of Kasrilevke know about the trial of Captain Alfred Dreyfus? All they know is that a Jewish officer serving in the French army was convicted of espionage and imprisoned on Devil's Island. The years are 1895 to 1898. Vayhi hayoim. One day it happened that Zedel Reb Shayas showed up in the house of study and told them a story. How in Paris, a certain Jewish Captain Dreyfus had been imprisoned because he had handed out some secret papers of his country. This story, Zedel will tell you, simply passed in one ear and out the other. One of them said, shrugging his shoulders, "What a Jew won't do for business." Another said bitterly, "Serves him right, a Jew who tries to crawl all the way up there to the highest places and mix with royalty." But later on, when Zedel came again to the house of study and told them a whole new story, that it was all a falsehood, that the Jewish Captain Dreyfus, the one who had been imprisoned, was the soul of innocence and the whole business was just a plot of a bunch of generals who were fighting one another, then the entire shtetl instantly took Dreyfus to heart. He became one of theirs, a Kasrilevke. Here begins the real plot, not the trial, but the town's reaction to the trial, not the facts, but the meaning of the facts as they understand them. "Did you hear?" one asks. The other answers, "I heard. Sentence for life. For nothing, for a lie." Gehört? Gehört. Verschickt auf ewig. Wieczne poselenie. Siehst, nicht. Ach, a bilbel. Kasrilevke quotes the verdict not in French, but in Russian. Wieczne poselenie, sentenced or exiled for life. That's what I call high Goyish. It's the language of imperial power. For them, this event is unprecedented and at first incomprehensible. Even so, they hold fast to their moral compass. So far as they're concerned, the Dreyfus affair is just another bilbel, a libel against the Jews. Let's remember where this Jewish debate is happening. It's all happening in the Beit Medrash, the study house. That's where Zedel first read the news about Dreyfus. In the symbolic landscape of shtetl fiction, the Beit Medrash is where the moral crisis of Jewish life gets played out. Then something unexpected happens. But after a while, they didn't have the patience to wait until Zedel got ready to come to the house of study and give them news of Captain Dreyfus. No, they had to go straight to Zedel's house. And finally, they didn't have the patience even to go to his house. No, they must go straight to the post office. Get the paper right there. Read it right there. And there discuss it over and over. Scream, disagree, and argue, everyone at the same time, exactly as usual. Every now and then, the postmaster would give them just a hint, you understand, in a very nice, polite tone of voice, you understand, that the post office wasn't a place for carryings on. It wasn't the synagogue. Тут не жидівська школа, жиді пархатє, тут не kahal shacher macherei. Ze aber gehört, wie hommen dem Grager. You dirty Jews, this isn't a Jewish school. This is not your kahal, where you do your crooked Jewish business. They heard him like Haman heard the Grager. It went in one ear and out the other. So, to the familiar shtetl landscape, Sholem Aleichem has added the post office. This to remind us that even the most God-forsaken shtetl is not impervious to what's happening outside, and also to cut the specter of political antisemitism down to comic size. The anti-Dreyfusards are to the Jews of France as the local Ukrainian postmaster is to the Jews of Kasrilevke. Then why is there nothing to fear? because the postmaster curses them in Low Goyish, in Ukrainian, not in Russian. And this is a Ukrainian that mixes a little bit of Yiddish. Shacha macharai is not a Ukrainian word. Okay, so this is Sholem Aleichem's Comedy of Crisis. It consists of 3 building blocks: comic collective action, comic dialogue, using all registers and local languages, and a tragic situation. Okay, so it's time to brush up on our history. What is the latest news from Paris? A famous writer named Émile Zola has just exposed all those who conspired against Dreyfus by publishing an open letter in a French newspaper. And when Zola himself is put on trial, someone named Laborie becomes his defense attorney. Kasrilevke gets busy memorizing the names of all the French generals and turns even that into a word game. But from out of this utterly foreign cast of characters, Kasrilevke suddenly finds 2 figures with whom it can totally identify: Zola and his defense attorney, Fernand Laborie, whose name they pronounce as Lamborie. "What do you think of Émile Zola's letters?" one asked the other. "Pearls, diamonds, rubies." As for Lamborie, they counted out to one another his virtues. They gave thanks for him. They found happiness in the very thought of him. They devoured, they smacked their lips over his oratory. Of course, no one in Kasrilevke could actually hear him make his speeches, but they knew anyway that his must be a voice of gold. Kasrilevke identifies with Zola and Lamborie because their power lies not in the sword, but in their speech. Since speech is their only weapon, I talk, therefore I am. The people of Kasrilevke revere those who stand up to defend the truth through their superior rhetorical powers. And indeed, thanks to Zola and his defenders, the French authorities accede to a retrial, and Dreyfus sets out from Devil's Island. The year is now 1899. On the great day when the news came that Dreyfus had arrived safely over the ocean, Kasrilevke declared a feast day, and if they hadn't been ashamed to, they'd have closed down all their businesses. By this point in the story, with the return of Dreyfus, all normal activity comes to a halt. There are no degrees of separation. Did you hear? He's arrived safely. Thanks be to God and his name. How I would have wanted to be right there in the room to see how it was, that first meeting with his wife. How I would have wanted to be right there to see when the little children were told, "Your father is here." Then, just when the suspense has reached a feverish pitch, catastrophe strikes. In the very midst of the trial, Laborie is the victim of an assassination attempt. "Almighty God," Kasrilevke prayed, "show your wonders now. You know very well how to make a miracle if only you want to. Perform the miracle now that Lamborie may live." And God, all blessings unto him, performed the miracle, and Lamborie lived. Time is telescoped as Kasrilevke reels from hope to despair to renewed hope. The ups and downs of the plot are moving ever faster. And now for the finale, the day of the final verdict. And when at last that first light showed, they leaped from their beds and ran to the post office. But it was still closed. Even the gate was locked. They gathered one after another around the post office until the street overflowed. They paced back and forth. They yawned, stretched, scratched their earlocks, murmured, Hallelujah, hallelujah. When Yarmo, the janitor, unlocked the gates of the post office, they all rushed inside at once. Yarmo became very angry. He showed them who was boss here, and he drove them with curses and insults out into the street. And there in the street, they waited and waited for shtetl to make his appearance. And when at last shtetl appeared, and when at last he picked up the paper and read aloud to them that nice passage about Dreyfus, there arose such a roar, such a protest, that the very heavens must have split. And this protest was not against the judge who had judged so badly. It was not against the generals who had sworn so falsely, nor against the Frenchmen who had covered themselves with so much shame. No, this protest was against shtetl, who read to them. It can't be, Kasrilevke screamed with one voice. It can't be. The heavens and the earth have promised that the truth must always come out on top, just as oil comes to the top of water. What will you tell us next? What lies? What stories? Idiots! Shouted poor shtetl with all the strength of his lungs, and he pushed the newspaper right into their faces. Here! See what it says! Here, in the paper! Paper! Cried Kasrilevke. Paper! And if you stood here with 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot on earth, we still wouldn't believe you. Such things cannot be. No, this cannot be. It cannot be. It cannot be. Well, it's hard to find a better example of Sholem Aleichem's talent for comic dialogue. But is this the end? Is this the final word? In the pages of Der Yid, the last paragraph reads as follows. And there's one more line to the story delivered in the measured cadence of the storyteller, narrator, correspondent. Blatt, schmat, schreit Kasrilevke. Und als du wirst sich stellen und da mit ein Fuß auf den Himmel und mit der anderen auf der Erde, wollen wir dir glauben? Es ist eine Sache, was es kann nicht sein. Es kann nicht sein. Es kann nicht sein. Es kann nicht sein. Und so ist es geblieben ad hayom hazeh. And so it remained until the present day. In other words, the face-off between Reb shtetl and all of Kasrilevke ends in a draw. Shtetl holds his ground, and so do the people of Kasrilevke, who refuse to accept defeat. When faced with a guilty verdict the second time around, with yet another miscarriage of justice, with a further instance of Jews being falsely accused, they refuse to accept the verdict at face value. They insist that the ultimate truth, God's truth, must prevail. Their faith is pitted against the facts, and that's that ad hayom hazeh. So what are we to make of this? Are we supposed to laugh at Kasrilevke or with Kasrilevke? That's been the question all along. But now that we've come to the end, it's time for us to reach a verdict. Is this satire or is this humor? Well, it's a bit of both. If we step back from the story and just look at the naked plot. Dreyfus in Kasrilevke borrows its plot from a Hebrew story called Ha'otzar, the treasure, that Sholem Aleichem wrote for his series, Scenes and Shadows from Jewish Life in Masapevka. It follows exactly the same four-part structure. The shtetl is thrown into turmoil by the arrival of seemingly catastrophic news from the outside. At first, the news is met with skepticism and scorn, but very quickly everyone is drawn in. All normal activity ceases as the story builds to a climax, but when the truth is revealed, they end up feeling duped and terribly disappointed. Back then, this story was clearly a spoof on shtetl insularity and backwardness. Oh, if only they could get over their foolish herd mentality. If only they could stop overreacting to every bit of news that penetrated from the outside world. That was Sholem Aleichem as a 19th century satirist. But what if the news from the outside was really bad news? Even when Jews cleaned up their act and served in their country's armed forces. Even in France, where, unlike Tsarist Russia, a Jew could enter the officer class, the hatred of Jews had become ideologically driven. The people of France had become blinded by their hatred, and the few good people could not stem the tide. Suddenly, not one innocent victim was being targeted, but a whole people. Suddenly, the odds were so great that this people, as a people, was powerless to effect change. That left only three possible responses. They could throw up their hands in despair. They could learn to live with the bitter truth. Here, see what it says in the paper. Or they could yell and scream, "Es kann nicht sein. No way. We refuse to allow the anti-Semitic mob to have the final word. We refuse to accept this injustice." So, here we come to the central paradox of Sholem Aleichem's humor, that it was rooted in a deep pessimism. In the short run, there was no chance of stemming the political tide. And in the long run, there was no chance of changing the human condition. Sholem Aleichem wrote Dreyfus and Kasrilevke against this bleak backdrop, where an ever-darkening shadow was being cast even over the center of enlightenment. Seen against this backdrop, was not the uncompromising moral stance of Kasrilevke somehow heroic? Could they not be seen in a tragicomic light as victors in defeat? This was Sholem Aleichem, the 20th century humorist. Toward the end of his life, after his self-exile from Russia in the wake of the terrible pogroms, and after his near-fatal attack of tuberculosis, Sholem Aleichem began revising his work for posterity. To create what he hoped to be a comédie juive, a Jewish comedy à la Balzac, Sholem Aleichem paid special attention to the Kasrilevke cycle. Stories he had originally written about other towns were Kasrilevized or Kasrilicized. In an ever-widening arc, he had the citizens of Kasrilevke confront the forces of modernity, not just political antisemitism, but also class conflict, nationalism, mass immigration, apostasy, pogroms. Kasrilevke became synonymous with the old home, embattled and soon to be abandoned. Meanwhile, he also edited the original Kasrilevke cycle, including, of course, Dreyfus and Kasrilevke, which he tightened up and made two significant changes. He changed the title from Es kann nicht sein, it cannot be, to Dreyfus and Kasrilevke, and changed the ending. Now listen to this. It turned out that for once, fiction was truer than fact, and in 1906, Captain Alfred Dreyfus was finally pardoned and reinstated. In the third and final round, justice did prevail. The truth of Kasrilevke was vindicated, at least for the time being, and Zadel, the local intellectual, the one who was media savvy, ended up with egg on his face. Exploiting his and our knowledge of the final outcome, Sholem Aleichem changed the story's ending from "Und so ist es geblieben ad hayom hazeh," and so it remained until this very day, to Asimen, wer ist gewen gerecht, well, and who was right? Who is the real hero of the story? The one who accepts reality, or the one who stubbornly holds out for a higher truth? The lone intellectual who lives with the bitter facts, or the embattled community that finds itself in the eye of the storm and tries to live by its wits? The hero of action or the hero of reaction? The world of the newspaper, of mass media, peddling the latest crisis, or the talking, laughing, joking, screaming, and crying community? The world of fact or the world of faith? The verdict is in, thanks to my sister Ruth Weiss in her classic study, The Schlemiel as Modern Hero. The Schlemiel, she writes in her timeless definition, becomes a hero when real action is impossible and reaction remains the only way a man can define himself. Who defined the Schlemiel as a modern hero and created a comedy of crisis starring a whole town of Schlemiels is none other than Sholem Aleichem. I wonder if there's another people in the whole world, to a man, woman, and child, that suspends all normal activity to await the return of a single hostage and rejoices in one voice when he is reunited with that family. I wonder if there's another people in the world that is credited with having a unique sense of humor. I wonder if there's another people in the world who, in their hour of greatest need, produced a comic writer to show them how to laugh their way through crisis and catastrophe.